everybody. Welcome to the Integrate Yourself podcast with Allison and Maya. Today we're speaking with Danny Roddy of DannyRoddy.com. He has written a book called Hair Like a Fox. He's got a huge online platform. You can find him on patreon.com/DannyRoddy. He has a podcast called Generative Energy Podcast, which is really, really great and very informative. And he's had his own journey with health and wellness and healing with nutrition, and I'm going to let him expand a little bit more on that. But first, I just want to start by saying welcome, Danny, to our show. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, Allison, Maya, thank you so much for having me. Total pleasure.
Well, it's our pleasure. We just finally get to talk to you a little bit more and find out how everything has been progressing since you started, because I also followed you way back when I first started, and when you were doing a little bit of your YouTubing and kind of starting your progression down the road of the Ray Pete world, like it would say.
Heresy, total heresy.
Right? Everyone's coming at you like, what are you talking about? So maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what you are doing currently.
Long story short, went through many different diets from like veganism to vegetarian, or probably vegetarianism to veganism to low carb to zero carb. And I think all that started probably around 2007. And then, so got to like speak to a lot of different people in the health sphere. I had did a podcast with a guy named Chris Kresser, who's like a big person in the paleo world. Got to talk to like Rob Wolf and was like on a chain email with these top paleo people for a while. And I guess got to like know that world pretty well. And so I was following them, doing my own research, and was mainly interested in hair loss. And that was the thing that I was mainly keyed in on, and thought that, hey, if I could only improve my like hair health, I think that would have like a ripple effect on my biology and help me feel better. Because I inherently knew that when I had like a bad mood or anxiety, or I was depressed, or my sleep wasn't good, that all like had an effect through my hair. My hair was like a barometer almost for my health. And so I was listening to all these different points of view of veganism, vegetarianism, paleo, low carb, ketogenic diets, zero carb. And I kind of made the mistake of every single time I started a new diet that like became me. So I had like put myself in an ideological cage like every single time I started a new diet. And so when I used to work at Apple Retail, and I just argue with my manager like 24/7 about veganism. And then one day I wasn't vegan anymore, and I like a part of me felt like it was like removed, and I was like, who am I? I don't even know anymore. And so
that's a big key that I'd like to talk about a little bit later, because we also do that in our work with the other people, is to find out the parts of us and how we change, and how we integrate them back. But continue, and we'll go back with that later. So
I mean, it's people have talked about it more intelligently than I have, but it is like such an important part of everything, I feel like, and why people just kind of have their blinders on to any kind of discourse about like especially keto or ketogenic diets right now.
That's a big one.
Or the veganism or whatever. So I guess I had looked so stupid so many times, and I was like publicly online at these times, and I was like, I was promoting veganism, I was promoting paleo, I was promoting zero carb, and for zero carb, I was like one, at least to me, I felt like I was like one of the people at the time that people would go to, that like I was known for my zero carb adventure. And so eventually, like 2010, I actually had like a relationship that was kind of imploding, and that was like the thing that allowed me to like kind of view things from a different perspective through her. And that's when I realized like I had been doing zero carb for like 2 years, and I looked horrible, felt not good at all, had like no libido. Like when we got like intimate, I wasn't sure if I was even able to like have sex, basically. And then I looked horrible. I didn't feel well, but I was like convincing myself that things were going to get better, but I had been doing it for 2 years. And so that imploded, felt horribly depressed, started like integrating starch a little bit in my diet, because that was popular at the time, like the Paul Jaminet perfect health diet people. And didn't really feel well with that either. And I was like, oh my God, I've done literally everything. I don't even know what to do. I don't even know what to do anymore. I feel like I've exhausted every single option. And
we can relate.
Yeah,
For sure.
and I think Matt Stone. Do you
Yeah.
ladies know who that
Yeah.
is? Okay.
Remember
And
Matt?
Matt was doing like a Ray May or something. He was talking about Ray Pete.
Oh, I remember he was
And,
one of the first people I remember hearing about talking about Ray Pete. Yeah. Yeah.
and I thought Ray Pete was somebody else. I thought he was this guy named Brian Peskin, and I had already looked at Brian's stuff. He was very like anti-fish oil, and I was like, I don't really like this guy, and so I wasn't really open to Ray's stuff immediately. And then I don't know like the exact events, but somehow, sometime during like late 2010, I think I saw Ray start talking about prolactin on his website. And I was like, oh, prolactin. I know that hormone is involved in baldness. And every doctor and I had high prolactin values on all my lab work. And I was like, I know when I ask a doctor about prolactin, they usually say, oh, it's genetic or something. They had like no, and genetic, that's like not even an answer. You know, it's just like,
it's just an excuse because they don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
really felt like that.
Think about it. Sorry.
Yeah, and long story short, I got hooked on Ray because I felt like he actually had some answers.
Right.
And I know he's like an incredibly controversial person, and it took me failing like 7 times on different diets, and also like this total despair to be ready to kind of like receive that information and to think differently. But I'm like just so happy I encountered him, because not only is like his nutrition information just, I feel like, stellar, but he as an individual is like an inspiring person. And then on top of that, I'm really interested in just his worldview in general. So there's like multiple layers to my like intense fascination with him. And then just like I've talked about it on other podcasts, but my friend was like, isn't it amazing that you can just email Ray and he'll email you back? Like he has no
Yeah,
commercialism about
that
him.
is amazing, actually.
I always just
I've heard, you know, Kate Deering, we had her on the show not too long ago, and she said the same thing. She said, I would just email him and he'd just answer all my questions. Like, she was amazed.
And he does it in a way where you may not get your answer like here, yes. He just say, here, look at this, and you need to go and research. That's what one of the things that I liked about what she said, was that he made you look in further than him just saying, yeah, I'm the authority, come let me tell you yes, and you'll know exactly what it's right or wrong, right? Yeah. So she said she had to do a lot of deeper look, but he would keep giving her information, so it was good that way.
Exactly. I remember asking him like 2 questions via email, and then him not answering the third one. And I was like, how rude. I can't believe he didn't answer my question. And it was so funny that I felt like that, because I feel like the next like 4 months I was trying to find the answer to that question. And I went down like probably lots of wrong avenues or whatever, but like that was like therapeutic in and of itself, trying to get an answer to that question. So he has like a quote somewhere saying things should make no sense until they make the right sense. Yeah. And sometimes I think about like I'm a lot of times motivated to read things that I don't really understand. And I'll be the first one to say like a lot of the stuff is over my head, but sometimes you read it over.
Yeah.
But, I used to remember when I was really in deep like stress, first starting this work, and I'd be like, what am I doing to myself? I don't even know what this said. I just
barely had the energy
I just read
to take
this thing,
it in.
and I feel like I can't even get this in. And I was just to help myself and cure myself. What am I doing?
Well, that's like we can talk about this more, but like that's where I feel like the pulse and temperature come in. Like you can take these objective markers and form a foundation where it's not like, hey, trust me, trust what I'm saying. I know what's best for you. You know, like anybody that has that approach is like a huge turnoff, you know, at least to me now.
Yeah.
But if you can like give somebody the keys, and I really feel like that's what Ray does. He's like, here's the map or whatever, and the map isn't finished. I said this in my last Patreon thing, but I feel like Ray is like if the body is a house, Ray is like looking through the window, and I'm like 10 blocks over trying to look through the same window. And then some health people aren't even in the right neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, but yeah, just like his work, sometimes I'm like, oh, well, if like parathyroid hormone increases prolactin, they both like shock the bones to release calcium in the blood. Like maybe they should have an effect on aldosterone. Then I'll look it up and like sure enough they do. So Ray's like work allows you to pursue things yourself without having to rely on like his direct answers. At least I've found that many times for myself.
Yeah, and I think
Have
it's
you found
because
any?
go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, have you found any indications of what you've kind of gone one direction and Ray's kind of going one direction, and you just seem to think like I remember Matt Stone, he had something about fructose. He didn't find that, or something about he didn't feel that went really well with Ray's things. He kind of went the other direction. And then we also know Josh and Jeannie. That's kind of where a lot of that metabolic blueprint, their program they had, helped us a lot. But then they kind of went off into their own direction. So I'm wondering, is there any place that you're kind of seeing that you're kind of going off a little bit from his work, or do you feel like you just kind of get stirred back into doing more of that, or
I guess for myself, I look at myself like a student basically, and like I'm 32, he's I think approaching 82, and so literally like 50 more years of experience and research, not to mention he's just way smarter than like I'll ever be, and you can tell like his depth of understanding about things is just like so intense. And that's not to say he's the guru, he always knows what's right, but at the same time there have been enough times to where he would say something like, for example, I used to eat vitamins A, D, and K orally, and I did that for a long time. And my digestion would always be like there would just be times where it'd get real wonky, and I'd be like, what is going on? Like I'm doing everything the same. I don't understand what's happening. And more or less, I would just do this for like a year or two. Like I couldn't understand what was going on. And then at one point, I was like, wait, Ray, I know doesn't use the vitamins orally, and I had known that. But I just never could get used to putting them on my skin, or like my pants are tighter, so it would like rub off on my whatever. Anyways, long story short, one time I found plastic wrap, and that sounds crazy, like to wrap yourself in plastic.
Awesome.
But it was actually way better than just putting them on and having it go off on the pants. And so I did that, and like within a few days, my digestion had improved like 100%. And so that's like a way of saying, when he says something, it's not like, oh, I have to go do this now. But sometimes later, 6 months, a year, 2 years, I'll be like, oh, that's why he does that.
Right.
And there have been lots of times where I have come to that conclusion. And so I'm very like hesitant to write off something he says, even if it seems kind of weird to me in like the first time he says it. And also I get the sense that he's like an incredibly sensitive individual, like sensitive environmentally. And I kind of have always felt like that for myself. And that's one of the reasons I don't think I fit with paleo people, because I think when I would have conversations with Chris or Rob or here Matt Lalonde, I think they thought, and this is just my reading, they thought people like me were hypochondriacs or crazy. And so And so just like small shifts in temperature and hands and feet and stuff. Like I remember Chris saying that was like not a big deal or whatever, or it meant you were going to live longer or something. And I was like, no, I know it makes me feel horrible when I'm freezing cold all the time. So not to dump on those people.
There's a fine line there, isn't there? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it is important. You know, you don't want to say it's not important, but at the same time, like you don't want to obsess about it either. So, but it always amazes me how that part of it is not addressed in those diets, like the temperature regulation. You know, like all these people are cold all the time. Like, why are you cold all the time? You know, and there's a reason. Yeah, you look great.
Well,
you may or whatever. You know, you have have a great body, but at what expense? Like, and it's not to say you can't have a great body doing being healthy and actually having a good temperature regulation, but you can do both. But it takes longer sometimes, I think, for some people. So that's kind of where it is, and Ray Peat's work is very, you kind of have to bring it to the individual. It's not one size fits all. And that's why I think too, people have a hard time like really taking in the information and understanding it, because they need, like you said, Danny, like maybe it's not going to work now, but it could work later. So, yeah.
Also, to your point last time, like the different interpretations of Ray's work are so like vast, you
Yeah.
know, like
Oh, yeah.
I would always, if anybody were to ask me like where should I learn more about Ray's work, I'd be like, well, avoid my work in all of the forums and groups about him, and then go
Yeah.
to his website or listen to him talk. And then I would also say it might be really confusing, and it might be literally painful to try to figure some of what he's saying out, but
Yeah.
it will be of huge benefit, I feel like, in the long run. And like just getting those basic things like, okay, the blood sugar goes lower, the adrenaline goes higher, the cortisol goes higher, like that basic physiology. I'm not saying everybody needs to become like a PubMed warrior or whatever, but having those basic things in place, I feel like protects the individual from like going astray or going down like a crazy rabbit hole.
Right.
And one of the things I like about Ray's work is it's so simple. Like the application of a lot of the things are simple. And so it doesn't need to be like the most complex thing in the universe. And so just as an example, a lot of like I talked to a lot of guys that take that drug finasteride and then they stop taking it. And then a lot of people are under the impression they have this like post finasteride syndrome. And they identify as that. So like I'm a PFS sufferer, and like the thinking that they have like an incurable disease or whatever. And so I feel like a lot.
Tell our listeners what finasteride is and what a P. Would you say P? I don't know.
Like so, finasteride is that popular baldness drug, or it's called Propecia,
Okay.
and so I had taken this drug a long time ago, and it just like reduced my libido to basically nothing. And I was like 22 or 21 at the time.
Wow.
And so I was like, okay, so, and then I encountered tons of men on the internet who had taken this drug and just felt like their lives were ruined. And so I no doubt think this drug is very dangerous, but I don't remember my point about my
You said something about being a
PFS sufferer.
Survivor.
Long story short, like starting whatever the person thinks is wrong with them, like taking like an objective approach, and then keeping it simple rather like you know, I remember why I brought this up. The guys with the PFS think they have like the most complicated problem on the planet, and I do think it's complex, but I don't think the therapies are complex. And so like keeping the thyroid function up, keeping the nutrition good, like eating liver and oysters and orange juice and milk and things, I think that would be like a best approach rather than getting into these like hyper complex regimens that take many different supplements and things like that. I always feel like that is the more complex an approach is, to me right now, usually that feels like the more incorrect it is.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
because
more complicated it is, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't. I always have to come back to the simple. Like life is about simplicity. You know, make it easy. I think it's KISS, keep it simple, stupid is the acronym for that. You know, and most people really want to make it complicated because they have to go to a doctor and then get the doctor to tell them everything that they need to know. And so we go into that whole authoritative, complex that people need to have, permission to be their own health, knower and researcher,
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. And one of the quotes Ray says that I just love to death is something to the effect of like using the nutrition and light and thyroid and progesterone. That's like a therapy in and of itself, like learning how to use those things. And I really feel strongly because I'm writing a new book, and one of the key like points or chapters I'm like focusing on is how to like get out of that mindset that you have to hand over your agency to a physician to like experiment on yourself. And I really think that's like a symptom of stress. But when Ray was talking about, I identified so closely with being cold all the time. And so when Ray was talking about that being an important factor in the rate of metabolism and resistance to stress and things like that, I was on board so fast. And I remember like ordering thyroid from Mexico like so quickly. But I understand that a lot of people don't like to do that kind of thing.
Well, let's talk about
that's
that.
a good lead. Yeah, because that's actually something that I noticed with working with just seeing the new Instagram post that Josh put out was that, people are, taking on the idea of just taking T3 or taking T4 or whatever and not knowing how to utilize it, or they don't have enough information, and then they cannot support themselves enough with the foods that they need. And so one of the problems is that people will start supplementing first before they're realizing how to support themselves. So maybe talk about that, because you did jump in, and maybe you can tell us, where are you now? Do you still take the thyroid? Have you stopped taking thyroid? What's goes on for you?
Yeah. So like, just to add a little context. So I think it's important to know that like the traditional diets probably included thyroid gland.
Yeah.
And so it might even be normal to eat thyroid regularly. And I think in like 1985, somebody ate a thyroid hamburger and got like thyrotoxicosis. And then the FDA banned the sale of thyroid after that.
Just
and
from
so
that one incident?
I'm pretty sure that's what the reference says. And so I think even if we were talking whenever this was, at 1984, 1985, like we all might eat thyroid in our food, like occasionally in sausage or something. So that's like one thing. And then the other thing is, I agree with Josh. I think I've seen like lots of horror stories. I'll rephrase it. Not horror stories, but just people saying, hey, I started taking thyroid, I don't feel good. I actually feel worse.
Yeah.
And I have no trouble believing that, not only because I know I've experienced that. Also, I was one Sinoplus tablet, which was like the type of thyroid I take. It's actually 3 grains. And at one point I thought it was 1 grain. And so I overdosed on it, like way overdosed, and felt really bad.
Wow.
And so there were like lots of missteps and things, and lots of things that I'm like, oh, that was stupid. Like, I can't believe you did that. But at the same time, all of that led to like a better understanding about myself. And so I would never want to be like, tell people what they could or couldn't use to make themselves feel better. And I think if we were forming like a foundation of reasonable things to do when you want to feel better, obviously nutrition is like very complex, how to use mushrooms or how to use the orange juice in milk. If the person doesn't tolerate milk, like maybe they have a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or something. Right. So there are like lots of different issues just with the food. And yeah, I occasionally will run into somebody that doesn't seem like they fully grasp what thyroid is going to do, and they'll take it and feel worse. So that is like definitely a possibility. And that's why I think finding the best information available is so important, And I always feel like if I'm just talking to somebody every month or something, and they're using me as their sole source of information, I feel like that's a really bad approach. And I'd always recommend like reading Broda Barnes's book, Hope for Hypothyroidism, the Unsuspected Illness. Yeah. And trying to really get into it, and at least on and that book is not a difficult read, or reading Hans Selye's older books and things like that. So just grasping the things. And I think even Ray said when he used to help people when they'd come to his house, like he'd assign them books to read, And so if somebody's talking to me one time, or I'm sure they see one of Josh's videos or something, and then they start taking thyroid and have no idea what's going on. Yeah, I don't think that's the best approach. But at the same time, that person's free to do whatever they want,
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Good point. So sometimes I think people have to go through something to learn from it too, and but yeah, and the food foundation's important. Like really, knowing like what you said with milk, it's a great example. Like, how about like working the carrot in, once a day before you start trying to do all that other stuff,
Exactly. And that's really important, I think. There was like a KMUD episode where somebody called in. They were like, hey, Ray, I'm depressed. I can't sleep. I have arthritis. I can't. My bowels are slow. They don't move. And just like a litany of different symptoms. And Ray's like, oh, have you tried the carrot salad? and it's
so simple.
It's like this. Yeah, it's so simple. Like try this basic thing that will lower endotoxin or serotonin or estrogen, and see how you feel, and make little incremental progress things. So yeah, just to beat a dead horse. But also sometimes I'll be talking to somebody who starts taking thyroid and will feel worse. And then I'll be like, well, are you eating liver like once a week or so? And they'll be like, oh no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
So it's just like, okay, well, this will probably be pretty difficult. Like, so again, you can't like micromanage everybody, but you can like tell them what you think, and you can give them your experience. And I don't think thyroid on like the scale or the spectrum of therapies is very dangerous. But at the same time, it doesn't mean it can't be like dangerous with somebody that has done no investigation on using it, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And I think someone was telling me like T3, because of its short life, you know, it has that it doesn't react as long, so in the body it will process out. But I think I understand where Josh and all of that kind of thinking comes in, is like, be prepared to hear. You may not be hearing everything, so just don't jump on the bandwagon for one thing, like, oh, you know, if I take thyroid I'm going to be okay. Well, this, you know, the other aspect is, you know, is your cholesterol low? Do you have issues with the other things, you know, and take variables in? It's just, you know, it's a hard lesson to learn on certain things. Like, especially I know for myself, I went into some things and I was like, whoa, we went a little crazy with the fat, you know, you know, like right. when I started to realize like chromometer was my friend, because it was like, you know, our food has a lot of fat in it. And then you try to reduce fat now, it's like, wow, I really have to like really pay attention to that part, because, you know, I don't want the estrogen to start building back up. I don't want to have that problem. And then to lose the weight that I gained when I first started, because I was just like ice cream here and milk here, and you know, and it was, you know, it was great because my body was feeling good. But then that poundage came and it was like, whoa, wait a minute, how's that going to work in, you know?
Yeah, the chronometer, the lab work if the person is inclined, and then the pulse and temperature. I almost feel like it's like my job to try not to convince the person that I'm right about anything, but to try to convince them to get those things on paper, you know. And the more information you have to play with, I feel like the more information is power, or whatever. I'm sure a lot of people said that, but like that is like some of the most important stuff. And then making good decisions based on your empirical information about yourself, coupled with like the best health information you find, whatever. In spoiler alert, it's not found on a forum. It's like, and I'm biased. I think it's really, Ray is like the best information available on the internet. So that's always my approach to things.
True.
Yeah, I tend to like to listen to him more than read, because it's just when I read, like, I can do it better now, but at first when I started,
there were like multiple steps. It was like listening to him, putting things together. Okay, like revisiting his articles, picking up like 1% instead of 0%, listening to him again, picking up 5%, picking up 10%, and then eventually going through his references, and then being like, oh yeah, he didn't make this up. This is verbatim what he. Verbatim what he said. So there were multiple levels, and I took a lot of humility to be like wrong about a lot of different things, because he like changes his mind a lot, and he
does. That's why I was confused at first, because I was used to hearing information like, okay, you do this, you do that, you know, and I think that's what a lot of people are used to, like the steps, right? And he's not like that. He changes because he realizes things change. So, you know.
Well, he has a quote, I think, in his Nutrition for Women book, and it's like, if we accept that knowledge is tentative and it's going to change, we'll be less likely to. I'm going to screw it up, but it's like less dogmatic about the ideas. Right. And he's like a true empiricist, because he used to not recommend mushrooms because assuming there was like the agarotine or hydrazine chemical, and then he found out like cooking them for 3 hours would get rid of it, and that mushrooms had like this host of unique benefits. So he changed his mind and started recommending. Like, I can't really think of many people, at least in my proximity of paleo people, that have significantly changed their ideas. Like Mark Sisson, I don't remember last time he completely flipped on something, you know?
No.
I think they're starting to flip a little bit on sugar, because they're talking about eating like dark chocolate, but that's about it, I think.
They're not going to the pure sugar or doing any
they haven't
fruit,
quite admitted it yet, but they are starting to work sugar back into the equation a little bit, but they don't want to go too crazy on it. Go ahead, Danny.
Well, I would talk a lot about that, but like I remember the same people basically progressing the idea that it was a toxic poison.
Yeah.
I think at a certain point wanted to seem progressive and flip their ideas on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I was like, that there's, it just rubbed me the wrong way because I knew like, it, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it was like a,
Just felt extreme maybe or something. Like it
yeah,
just didn't
but it
make
was like, oh,
sense. Yeah.
you've been saying these things are the sugar is very toxic, and now you're looking progressive and you're trying to change your mind about it. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a very humbling stage to start realizing, like what you just said when we were started was, you were one way, and then you had to realize that did not really make a lot of sense. But once you learned something new, you were willing to adapt to it, and that's the humility. Like the humility is to know that you just don't know everything, and you never
Yeah.
will, but you'll get to that point where you're like, okay, I don't need to be like stuck where I'm at. I just need to just say, this is how I thought, and this is why I changed it. And so now this is what I think on this forward movement. Like, and one of the things that makes me crack up thinking is like, the whole sugar idea is like so important for the brain, and we wonder where all these people are just getting so like, emotionally tied up. They're getting so like frustrated. And you think how often your brain needs that sugar. And it's like, wow, you can't live without sugar. It just doesn't make any sense,
Hmm.
Yeah. It's a
Well, yeah, you'll
physiological fact, basically. I mean, I remember learning it in exercise physiology when I was in college. It's like
uh,
very elementary for athletes to, recover with glucose. So, I mean,
I think it's like an easy scapegoat and it's culturally acceptable. And
yeah,
so
Mm.
I don't feel like once those two things merge, it's like hard for anybody to like get out of that mindset a lot of the time. And I don't think I would have ever reached that conclusion had I not done no sugar for 2 years, more than that. Like
right.
even when I was vegan and vegetarian, I stayed away from any kind of sugar. And so knowing that that didn't like improve my health and really feeling compelled that stress was the umbrella term for just all of the different problems. Like I had no
Mm.
trouble believing that, especially after reading Hans Selye's books. But and then kind of understanding when the blood sugar decreases, you're going to increase the CRH, the hypothalamus, the pituitary adrenal
Okay.
systems,
Yeah.
and it was just like, oh, this kind of I'm finally putting the pieces together to why sugar would be really important for restraining the stress response, and so I don't think I had the pieces before. Like if somebody asked me why sugar was bad in my vegan days, I would have just had a blank face. I don't think or I would have made something up that I didn't
Yeah.
understand. or
Right.
and same with the low carb, zero carb people. Like just a minimal amount of investigation
Hmm.
kind of like shatters those various myths about the insulin spikes and things like that. So those things are real easy elevator pitches though a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I've shared that I was on the antifungal diet for like 3 years on and off,
Same.
basically.
That's
And
why
so
I went on
no
zero carb.
sugar. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
totally hit a brick wall. I just with energy, and I felt like, I mean, I think I was in my or late 30s or in mid 30s, and I couldn't believe how terrible I felt. And I just could I had to have these naps in the afternoon. I couldn't, I had no energy, and my muscle was wasting. I looked, I lost a lot of weight, and I was kind of skinny, but I wasn't like, there was no
Functioning.
muscle there. And I still
Yeah.
had a bloated belly. So
Yeah.
it was kind of like, wow, this just wasn't working. And as soon as I started to work in, I got connected with Josh and Jeannie and started working with them. And he was like, oh, really, you just need to start working sugar back into your diet. I'm like, what? Like, that makes no sense. And I was like, trusted him on it, at first, but it was hard for me to really get into it. And that's when I started looking at Ray Peat's stuff, and it my belly went away. I started feeling like way more energetic and so much better. So I was like, yeah, this is it. So, and before that, it was just like, what else can I eliminate? It's like
Yeah.
I've done it
And
all.
And that's the box that we start creating with all this, like you got to stop eating this and you can only eat that. And then people get like locked in and it's like you miss like, life becomes a drag because you're constantly worried about what you're eating and how you're eating it and which way it needs to be prepared and all the other symptoms that we kind of put with it together, which is really draining for the mind and the body's just like, can you just let me have what I need? Stop. This craving is not a willpower thing. This is a real thing that I need to survive. Like,
Right.
this is something,
I,
and go ahead. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. That's so important. I feel like the idea that like the better off you are with some kind of diet is the more willpower you have to resist
Oh, yeah.
your basic like biological urges. I think that's so hilarious. Well, not only because I entertained the idea for many different years, but it'd be like
Yeah.
the similar kind of thing of like, oh, you need to go to the bathroom. We'll just hold it as long
Yeah.
as possible.
That's a great
And
analogy. Wow.
and so I
You know
don't
how
know.
much
We have these.
trauma that
Yeah,
people have had
Yeah.
because they couldn't go to the bathroom in a public place,
Oh
or
God.
they,
Yeah.
I couldn't go to the bathroom at school, so they had to wait until they got home, or it's like that analogy is true. It's like you were putting so much more tension in your system because you've got this idea that you can't do something. It's like, wow,
and,
really?
and then on top of that, so say the person is under the impression they should restrict sugar or whatever, and then you have like the keto people saying, well, that's gluconeogenesis or like the creation of new sugar from protein like through the liver.
Hmm.
That's actually better. And so
No.
But
you
why are they saying
you have like
that? I don't understand.
you have
Like, if you know
God only
science,
knows.
it doesn't make sense, right?
But you have like a spin on the bad stuff. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Dominic D Agostino was on Joe
I
Rogan's
just saw
podcast.
that. I saw you
Yeah.
mentioned that on Patreon, and I was like, I
Okay.
just watched that. That's so funny.
And he's like our incredibly intelligent person. I'm sure I'd
Yeah.
like love to hang out with him or whatever. But like some of the things you were saying, I was like, oh, that thing he thinks is good is actually I think is bad. And so it's like
Yeah.
these different interpretations of, oh, keto is making the person healthier. When I would say, or using a lot of Ray's different like framework for things and references I have, I would be like, oh, that's actually not a good thing. And so yeah, it's just like I really feel for anybody trying to navigate these waters.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's just about finding the best information possible and using your intuition to find the information and then also take the empirical route and get information about yourself so you're not led astray.
Right.
And like just as an example, like if your you have four parathyroid glands in the back of your thyroid, and those like raise when somebody doesn't eat any calcium or their diet is insufficient in calcium.
Hmm.
And so or their diet has too much phosphate. And so they could go get a lab test, get the results back, and then they could kind of gauge how much calcium was in their diet. And so that's like just a one method of, I think, construct or like figuring out something about yourself that has nothing to do with whatever anybody else says. And that's taking like your information
Right.
and then trying to apply it. And the other way would be, I'm going to be a vegan now and hope just my problems go away, or I'm going to be keto now and just hope my problems go away, where you're taking like a more empirical approach.
Yeah.
One of the things I noticed is the view is the short term. Like, let me get this goal now. I don't really consider the whole big picture. And so, one of the things I keep coming back to with helping other people is to say, longevity wise, do you understand what what the consequences are gonna be for what you're asking for? So if I say I want to fit into a dress for a wedding, right, and I'm gonna do everything I can, I'm gonna starve myself, I'm gonna work out, I'm gonna do everything I can. You'll make it, you'll have it happen.
Yeah.
But did you notice that you're not sleeping? Do you notice your drive is down? Did you notice that your hair's lost a lot of bounce or whatever? Maybe you've lost some hair.
Mhm.
Like these are the long-term things that start to show up with life, and you start to see how the health changes. And every time you do these little bit of intermittent fastings or a little bit of dietings or kind of these little fad things. And I call them fad because they just fade in and out because you're just not sustainable. You just can't stay on these things forever, unless you're, really kind of kicking your ass all the day long, so. Go ahead.
There is a quote by, I think, Abraham Maslow, and it's like, to change somebody's mind, you need to change their awareness of themselves. And I think that's, and it's, again, it's like really what we're talking about, I feel like. But if you, like you just said, like, how's your sleep? Are you waking up in the middle of the night, or like, is it really hard to get to bed? Is your mind racing, or do you find it like incredibly difficult to get up in the morning, or is your libido not as good as it used to be? Is like the climax not that good, or whatever? Is it like whatever, your endurance? If you start prodding the person, and again, it's not because like you're so smart or you have all the answers. I think part of the therapy is like getting the person to acknowledge, aware of different things in their life and what they might be caused by. And that's really what I felt like Ray was so important to me, because he was saying things and I was like, it's not normal to wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. every night and go to the bathroom. Like that's like an adrenaline response.
Right.
And I would have just thought nothing of it until he mentioned it. So, it's hard to like convince somebody that there's a problem if they don't even know that what they're experiencing is like problematic, basically.
And that's where I think the issue lies with most of the diets, and why they don't, maybe these people who are really super smart in the industry don't understand, because they don't understand like that maybe that's not healthy, like some of these responses, and there's like another circle of truth that goes beyond that. And so really knowing yourself and also trusting yourself is super important, I think, in the process.
And I agree. And at the same time, sometimes questioning the therapy. So I had a friend named Lex Rooker who was like, used to be on the 0 carb diet with me. And he was like 60 and I was in my mid 20s. But he told me stories about when he was a kid, he had acne. He used to go to the doctor to get irradiated in his face for the acne. And so that was considered safe at the time, which later obviously caused cancer and a bunch of other problems. But even things like I think people are more aware of the dangers of like estrogen therapy, but even like fish oil, fish oil probably falls into that same category of extremely risky. But it could, like, part of the problem with the PUFA is it breaks down into these things called prostaglandins, and fish oil inhibits the production of the prostaglandin. So it's kind of having this anti-inflammatory effect by accident. And then there's a ton of other problems with them besides just that little thing. And so I think you have to ask questions about just the basic therapies and things like that, because a lot of people just like aren't ready to even question those mainstream things like fish oil and things like that.
Yeah, well, can we talk a little more about the fish oil? Because is that okay, Maya? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Absolutely. I was just going to say, like, that's a perfect example of it works for the beginning, right? People start feeling okay with it, oh, I take fish oil, I feel good. But it's like later on, that stuff starts to wear you down, and they don't even recognize that part, because it's a connection to like your liver and how it's having to process longer. And so keep going with the fish oil.
I'll also say that we've referenced your book in one of our shows. I don't remember which show it is off the top of my head, but with that study on essential oils and or essential fatty acids, and how like it's based on, I think, the health of it and why it's recommended. It's based on like really one study that was kind of flawed, right? So in a way, I mean, it was like more of short-term effects, and then the long-term they didn't really study. And so
I think it was the Burrs that did like the original studies in the 1930s, and they
with the mice,
I might screw it up. I should have read up on it before we talk. But I think you supplementing the rats with B6 cured all the so-called deficiency of essential fatty acids.
Yes.
And I think when you look at at least, so I would come from approach it from the hair loss point of view, because I feel like that's like the best angle for me to take, because I feel like
so well.
Well, it's like it's just easier to like talk about that. But the EPA and DHA are like these longer chain fatty acids, and they're like incredibly susceptible to lipid peroxidation. And so that's when like during the oxidative stress, when the electrons are being like passed through the cell ultimately to oxygen, if things like thyroid or oxygen isn't available because carbon dioxide is low, the electrons will start interacting with like proteins and fats in the cell, and they'll interact with these long chain fatty acids and cause lipid peroxidation. And this is like incredibly harmful for the mitochondria. And so the mitochondria, I forget what paper said this, but they called them like stress response modulators. So if the mitochondria weren't functioning right, the person wasn't going to be able to produce efficient energy, and then they were going to have to adapt with their pituitary and adrenal stress systems. Yeah. And so if you just like kind of paint a small picture of what's going on with the stress, I think the fish oils like don't make basically like any kind of sense to take for health. Yeah. And then on top of that, if you type in like what's it called, people vaping or whatever, that's really popular right now. Like one of the problems with vaping is that it creates this like toxin called acrolein. And so if you type in like vaping and acrolein, you'll find a bunch of people that have talked about this. And DHA is like a precursor for acrolein production.
Wow. Oh, wow. So I didn't know that part.
I didn't either.
And then cod liver oil, they tested I might be screwing up this study a little bit, but they tested a bunch of different fats, and cod liver oil was like the worst offender with the production of acrolein.
Wow.
And so they're the isoprostanes and neuroprostanes, like they break down into these tons of different chemicals, and all of them appear to have like negative effects on the mitochondria. Like acrolein is like a powerful inhibitor of mitochondrial function. I think it's really associated with Alzheimer's. And
goodness.
So it's and again, like if you go back to the paleo world, people have really put in all the chips on fish oil being a good thing, or at least eating fish, you know, even if they don't say fish oil is good, or taking boutique fancy cod liver oil or whatever.
Right.
So it's like really, and I know this from personal experience, it's really hard to like shift your thoughts on that, because you have to have like an insane sense of humility, because you're saying, oh, I was wrong. And not only that, I was making money off of these fish oil products. And also I might have been like actively harming many people. And so it's like, it's a real tough position to be in.
Yeah. Which you brought up something is I've heard a lot in the health industry, is everyone's talking about the HPA access and how much this is a big concern to, keep your adrenals from fatiguing out. But then like one of the things that, we've always heard is the dogmatic, chronic fatigue syndromes, or whatever they call it, based on the idea of just looking at that whole system and saying, okay, well, that's the reason why your adrenals are taxed. But then not saying, okay, well, wait a minute, what's causing the adrenaline and the cortisol to crash and not recreate itself, or what is it that you're constantly inhibiting? And I think someone just talked about like how much, testing the cortisol and seeing what's happening in your system will change. And, it's not so much that you're not getting enough of it. It's that you can't even produce it. So then it has to go shifting into the physiology where they don't want to go. It's almost like some part of it is just limited on this idea of, we found where it's crashing, but we don't want to know how it flows with the rest of the body, and how that part of the whole system needs to be able to be supported before it can be repaired. And so that's where I find I get a little bit like, wow, you're still missing the other part of this. Like, thanks for the information, but come on, like, look over here.
Yeah, I agree.
Are you talking about specifically about like those cortisol rhythms that people will get for cortisol?
Yeah. And then they talk about it like in terms of like HPA access, in terms of how you're adrenalizing yourself in one way through the I think is it hypothalamus, I can't pronounce
hypothalamus, and then I think that like activates the pituitary, and then pituitary usually activates the adrenal system. Yeah.
Right. But then that whole concept still doesn't go into changing the diet and allowing sugar in.
Yeah. Because the therapy is still to give cortisol, right? And DHEA and.
A long time ago, I went to like a anti-aging doctor, and he had like a book on his desk, and it's called like Safe Uses of Cortisol by Dr. Jeffries. And this is one of the, I think, like godfathers of, I don't think he termed adrenal fatigue or whatever, but I think a lot of people started using cortisol because of him. And my doctor put me on Cortef. And so that's like a synthetic cortisol, because he tested my saliva cortisol levels and DHA and stuff, and mine had some funky rhythm or whatever. And I just remember at this specific time, just like feeling like worse than I'd ever felt in my like entire life. And and so it wasn't easy for me to think that. I think Ray has like a very specific explanation for why testing hormones in the saliva is bogus. I think it's something to do with. I won't even go there because I forget what he said. But I take, for what it's worth, I take like all lab tests with a grain of salt. I really try to go by like just my general understanding of symptoms and things like that, and then using the lab tests, and then also going with the symptoms and like easy, non-intrusive ways of moving the situation like a favorable direction. But some of the therapies that come, or so-called therapies that come out of the adrenal fatigue world, are just real nutty. Like they'll use ridiculously high levels of DHEA.
Yeah.
I remember a doctor telling me like 50 milligrams twice a day, and I think like a normal healthy young person makes about like 5 milligrams per day.
Oh God. Wow. It's crazy. Why don't they just eat food? I was helping somebody, after like 5 years of after cancer, post cancer, and I can see it very clearly. It's an energy regeneration thing. Like she just really needs more energy because her body's going through an intense healing process. And of course, the doctor, she goes to her naturopath, comes back, oh, she's going to put me, they tested my adrenal. She's going to put me on some cortisol and DHEA. And so, whatever.
I mean,
you just hope that they listened to what food options you gave, right?
Yeah.
So that she kind of say,
that's what
please support yourself.
So I'm hoping that will help. So but I guess why I said that was because they are still recommending those things, and I'm really surprised by that. But
I think I took like testosterone for a while too when I was like vegan, and I was like 120 pounds, like injecting testosterone.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the things like my anti-aging doctor believed were just like so crazy. Like, and he was like entertaining kind of my lunacy and like injecting his own lunacy into the situation. But we did some of like the craziest shit together. Like that, like looking back, I'm just like, I can't believe he let me do that, or that he recommended that thing. And I think and I think if you think and I lived through it to tell about it.
Yeah.
And I went on tour and did it on tour too, which was even more bizarre. So that's a whole different story. But looking back on it's crazy. But again, I think some of these people, especially like that doctor, had probably didn't think that the person could regenerate. Like a lot of people are under the impression that the person is genetically frail or whatever, and they're going to fall apart. And so there's no hope of renewing. And so I think maybe if the person thought that was like actually the right way of how human physiology played out, maybe some of his therapies made sense. But if the person can regenerate and it takes good thyroid function and like low cortisol and low estrogen and serotonin and prolactin, and making sure light is good and digestion is good, and the person isn't leaning towards constipation or diarrhea or things like that, if you like focus on all those variables, I think it paints a different picture. And so again, it's just with like what the person is, like what their point of view is, and then how that plays out and what they want to do to you, basically.
Yeah. And I think that's the part where, the other side of the coin, where, you want to be wary of every supplement you take and being concerned about it. But there's also a part where with, experimenting, like you really want to have like an understanding that you're not going to break. You may feel a little crappy after trying something, but you will recover. Like there is a recovery time that and if it doesn't work, stop, and then if it didn't work this time, doesn't mean it's not going to work the next time. But it is that, like, you've got to be able to free yourself and allowing yourself to experience these things, because all of it matters in terms of where you're going to be and what you're doing and how you're going to be doing it. And so, like you survived, right? You did the worst things you could think of in your mind, but you still got through it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And your results are changed, you kind of, I would assume you're not the same person anyway, like you were when you first started, right? Because you seem to have a lot more energy. You haven't lost your hair. It looks like everything's kind of changed for the better. So,
I totally agree. My friend Karen, I did a few podcasts with her, and she's like one of my like inspiration people. I like love talking to her because she'll always say something and I'll think about it for a long time. And she's like, Danny, I don't know anybody that's like asked me questions or I've talked to, and then I'll talk to them later and they'll be like, thank you so much for solving my life problem. And she's like, I've never heard anybody like say that before. And I was like, yeah, nobody ever says that. That's not like a thing. And and it's like, yeah, like this, I understand why thinking about Ray's like prolific amount of work is like overwhelming, and engaging with it is even more overwhelming, and trying to figure things out. Like that's correct. She says that it's courageous to want to do that and want to heal, and specifically in a way that seems like overcomplicated or that you don't fully understand. Like it's amazing that people even do that. But at the same time, it's like you said, it's like a long journey. I think I literally started messing around with food and stuff in 2006, 2007. And like, I feel like I learn things about myself like every day. And so for anybody to think like that I'm going to talk to somebody on Skype or whatever, and they're just going to surrender their will like over to me to let me fix them or whatever, is just really like, I even think about if I had full access to Repeat or something in 2010, would that have like expedited my healing process? Like probably not, because
Right.
I remember a lot of those like failures being major aha moments, and like William Blake has a quote, and it's like, you never know what's enough until you know what is too much. And I feel like
Yeah.
I'm like the poster boy for that. Like thing, like I've like overdosed on everything and been like, oh, that's where the limit ends on that thing. And so and like I don't think Ray could have explained that. Those were just things I had to experience. I had to go through my own, basically. So yeah, it's a wild ride.
Totally.
Yeah, we talked about this with Kate, where we were so appreciative of her book. Have you read her book? Do you know?
I haven't, but everybody I've ever talked to about it says it's excellent.
So it's like the baby book that we would have liked to start with Ray's work. Like it is simple in terms of the, like some people come into it and they're like, well, I don't agree with this. Okay, great. Then like I have someone I know, and we interviewed her. She had a kidney transplant and years ago and had some estrogen dominance, and so she's starting to delve in, and every time she was talking, she's like, that makes so much sense. And then but it made it so simple for her that all she's doing, she can't even really do like a quarter of what the book's saying, but as she's just simply gotten into it, she's feeling so much better, and she's not in that overwhelmed stage where like we talked about earlier. But that was the best, like little, it's just a little bit of food of thought that you can just start with, and then progress into Ray's work and Hans Sele's and everyone else's work, but it is, I guess, what we kind of laughed and said, yeah, I would have loved to have that book when we started.
Yeah, it would have been much easier, but
That's good to know. People always reference it, and I'll be like, oh, that was really simply worded, and simple is the best thing, I feel like. So yeah, I always like tried to make videos that being like, oh, this will answer so many people's questions. But I think I've gotten to the point where like I really like to like satisfy my own curiosity.
Yeah.
And so I think that has like moved me into like some kind of direction where it turns a lot of people off.
Well, you seem to have a big following, though. It seems like people really like what you put out there. Yeah.
One of the reasons like that I like to talk about hair loss specifically is I think there's like so much bad information out there about it, and obviously there's so many different points of view on like diabetes or like hypertension and stuff.
Right.
And eventually there's just like this path where I was like, I can keep learning about hair loss or whatever, or I can go down and get into like the minutia of the diet world. And since I didn't see like that much value in it, and also I have like this intense curiosity about the hair loss, and so I was like, I'll just go down this road instead.
Yeah, I think
I'm glad you did.
Yeah. We both, I think Maya and I both were really curious about the aging aspect, since we're in our 40s now, and we're coming across stuff that you just can't, no matter how hard you try with your diet, you can will all you want, have that willpower, but it doesn't change anything. So I'm glad we got, stumbled onto this information earlier on so that I wouldn't have to start now as opposed to, but it really did prepare me for middle age. And like, for women anyway, there's a lot of things that doctors will tell women, I don't know, or take estrogen, and they're still actually recommending that, which is just crazy. But, yeah, so that's kind of what the similar thing we're just like really interested in. It's not like, do this to lose weight. It's more about, hey, let's like, go through the aging process more gracefully, and not just accept that this stuff is just happening because it's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Like, so the new book I'm writing, I'm basically trying to convince the reader, don't ask like what causes hair loss, ask what causes aging.
Yeah.
And because like the one thing that is the most, like the biggest determinant of whether somebody loses their hair is their age. Has nothing to do with like literally nothing else, not the DHT, not the 5-alpha reductase or whatever. It's the more advanced the age, the more likely the man or the woman is going to experience so-called male pattern baldness.
Yeah.
And so the younger guys, like the guys 16, 17, 18 and in their early 20s that I talk to like regularly and like post on baldness forums, like, I'm 16 and I'm going bald. What do I do? It's like crazy.
Oh, wow.
Like, I think those people are, and one study, I think or article in 2010 by a guy named Trueb said that baldness was like a premature aging phenomenon. And like for women, I would say like PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome was like a premature aging phenomenon. And then menopause has been called like a major landmark in aging. And I don't know if so-called andropause or whatever I think it's a little different. But so it's like you look at all these things and it's really in the context of aging and stress, and aging and stress being like synonymous basically. And so, and yeah, just like you two, those were the big questions that I was really interested in learning about, because again, if you're thinking about having the keys to like do things yourself versus, I wonder what Ray thinks about this, I'm going to email him. Like, obviously he's good for things like that you have no idea about or never be able to understand or whatever. And it's amazing that he's alive and you have this resource that will email you back, or like clarification about his work. But at the same time, asking these big questions and then trying to find an answer, like a general answer to them, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, the thing that I kind of always wanted to see is how much research have you noticed about like male baldness being synonymous with aggression and emotional instabilities. Like the PubMed, I haven't been able to research a lot of this, but I see a connection where a lot of these athletes have become bald as they're getting older, like 16-year-olds, like you said, the 18-year-olds having the hair loss, but they're really big athletes. Or there's the whole mid section of life where everyone's trying to be so conditioned, trying to look, a certain way or whatever. And you're starting to see that, the hair loss is a deemed, good thing. Bald, guys are, everywhere. It seems in some ways I find that I'm noticing that connection, but I haven't had the time to research like how that is all connecting to hair loss in terms of like aggression or what's going on with them in terms of like, what life's kind of showing up, that they're advancing their aging through all their activities.
Yeah, that's like the kind of stereotypical explanation that masculinity is involved, causes the baldness, and so that's why men are more likely to experience like that horseshoe shaped pattern. But one of the things I really like to think about is I don't know if there's like a technical name for it, but it's like neonatal male pattern baldness. So like newborns of both sexes, like when they exit the womb over like the first 1 or 2 years of life, will have like a horseshoe shaped baldness. And so it's like the genetic explanation really makes no sense when you think about the neonatal baldness. And then when you look at the like a hormonal situation of like an infant, boy or girl, they usually have like crazy high prolactin levels when they're born. Sometimes it's called like witch's milk, which they'll like have milk out of their breasts. And so I think
that's with mothers that are like hypothyroid symptoms. Not to say that they have hypothyroid, but they have the low energy, and maybe when they had the child, something else kind of created, in vitro and all that. And when they kind of had their babies, the energy wasn't able to sustain all of what it needed to the development stages. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I need to read more about it, and so I'm going to speculate a little bit. But I think the delivery process is really stressful for the newborn. And I think when the baby's in the womb, it actually has like a low concentration of oxygen and a high concentration of carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. And so immediately when it like enters the normal oxygenated environment, I think that's like a powerful stress to the newborn infant. And I think I would hypothesize that's one of the reasons the prolactin goes up, because I think many different experiments, if they expose animals to like pure oxygen, all their stress hormones will go up. And likewise, like living at altitude, the thyroid hormone goes up and like prolactin and other stress variables go down. And so this brings up the importance of thyroid and the creation of carbon dioxide, which is just typically completely not addressed at all in the health world. And Chris Masterjohn, who you should probably talk to at some point, but he's like one of the open-minded, slightly paleo people that is actually just a really good resource, I feel like. And he's talking about how carbon dioxide is important. It's one of the reasons you probably want to go into ketosis to produce less carbon dioxide. And also carbon dioxide is like a cofactor for vitamin K. And the more carbon dioxide, the more vitamin K can like do its job. And so like I don't know anybody that doesn't think vitamin K is important. So obviously carbon dioxide would be very significant. And so I think one of the motivators for me to like keep going was I had accumulated so many references of papers saying there is no difference between men with baldness and men without baldness in like the androgen hormones. And so they keep like trying to find a difference in testosterone or dihydrotestosterone, and they just come up empty-handed. But it doesn't matter because the myth has like cemented itself. And so just you'll read a paper and it will start off with the myth, and then it will go into like the findings of the study, and it's just like told over and over again. And there have been like few papers where the author has really questioned the idea like the masculinity is causing the baldness. And I think the things like the neonatal male pattern baldness, the polycystic ovarian syndrome being associated with the so-called androgenic hair loss, that's a condition where too much estrogen. Contraceptive pill use is very associated with developing male pattern baldness. Post-menopause is very associated with developing male pattern baldness. And so these are all situations where like the estrogen goes up and the progesterone goes down, and the estrogen and the cortisol and all the things that interfere with the hair cycle. And so, and even if you go back, like if you look at most of the baldness drugs, like one's called cyproterone acetate, another one's called like spironolactone, and then obviously the newest one is specifically for guys is the finasteride. All of those drugs are progestogenic or progesterone-like. And I think it shows how amazing progesterone is. Yeah. And I think guys are like Ray's made the case a few times that women, because of their like cephalization, are like a little bit more evolved than men are, because they have like a bigger head, smaller eye ratio or something. And I need to read more about it, but I think that's because women naturally have more progesterone than men, and I think that protects them from baldness, among other things.
Interesting.
Well, that's interesting because as you were talking, I remembered that connection to women also are getting bioidentical. They think they're getting progesterone, but they're not. They're getting the estradiol or the estrogen part of the progesterone conversion, so that there's a little bit of extra something that makes it more estrogen than it is the pure estrogen. And so like mainly what made me think of why some of these I kind of lost where I was going, but I wanted to say something about how we are similar. Like you're getting men are getting this supplement, and we're getting a supplement that's supposed to be like progesterone, but it's not. It's really not what we're getting at all.
Yeah. I don't have any confidence in. I've taken Progesti, that Kenogen brand, and it just seems like it's so hard to make a good supplement. And like I've seen people take like new kinds of thyroid, and then they get their lab test back and it looks like the thyroid doesn't work at all. And so it's like you have to be, I feel like, extremely judicious about the supplements you do and do not use. And that was even going back to rubbing the vitamins on the skin. It seems like the intestine is such a big part of like the harmonious interaction between all the hormones. And if you have like constant agitation in the intestine, it would be probably impossible to get the hormonal situation sorted out. And so that's why sometimes I'll talk to somebody and they'll list all the supplements they're taking. They're taking like 20 different supplements. And I'm like, for what it's worth, you might think about, like, if you eat liver, eggs, and oysters, you might think about dropping all of these.
Yeah, right.
Because each one of these is like a potential allergen to the intestine. So, and putting myself back in that person's shoes, I remember feeling like supplements were a crutch at one point, and I thought something bad would happen if I stopped taking them. And so I think it's like a psychological or stress kind of related thing as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who have their own issues with food. Talking about liver, to some people they just like turn white, and they don't even want you to like suggest like some ideas how to take it. Like people have cut up pieces and frozen them. There's people who make pâtés. There's people who do all these things to kind of change the taste, make them into tacos or whatever. But if you just say liver, they just go, no way. Like you say, they just drop back and like. But these are these dogmatic thoughts that people have that, like this food isn't good, oysters aren't that great, this is kind of not my flavor or my texture. I don't like this, I don't like that. So it's really hard to kind of help people like progress back into like the simplest things are there.
Yeah.
So
you're right. I think the making things like pâtés sometimes can warm people up to liver, but yeah, I think I had like the unique ability to convince myself that if it was like healthy that I could do it. And and I know that not a lot, I mean, some other people I've talked to don't have that ability. And I could like eat tree bark. I felt like if it brought me was useful to my life in general. And so, but yeah, I sympathize with like not having that point of view.
Danny, you want to tell us more a little bit about your book that you're writing right now? And
yeah, I wrote that first book, Hair Like a Fox, which is funny saying the title now because it just like seems so long ago. But I wrote that in like 2013. Didn't have access to lots of papers at the time, so it was really just like a bad writing experience, and it was like really difficult.
It's good. I thought it was well written. So
I think that's because the editor was like incredible, and I feel like he saved like a burning dumpster fire. And so like I finished that book and I was like, oh God, I'm thankful that I'll never have to write about this topic again, because I just thought I had done it, like written like finished what I was working on.
Yeah.
And then I kept getting like really good, intelligent questions that I had not addressed in the book or just glossed over because I didn't know. So, for example, somebody was like, why does that shape happen? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I have no idea why it happened. and
thought about that.
And so eventually, I don't know when exactly, but at some point I was like, my work is like not finished. And I became more interested in it. And had like re-synthesized some of the ideas in like a YouTube series called Organizing the Panic, which is like the bald myth on YouTube or whatever. And then done a series of other YouTube videos, and eventually was like, I think I have enough material to like write another book. And I really wanted to work with this artist named Daeyoon Kim. Okay. And I was like, you know what? I think if he does the cover, I'll do another book. And like I wrote him, and he said yes. And I was like, shit, I have to write this book now.
Darn it. I was hoping you'd say no.
You set yourself up, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, really. And so I'm going real slow, and because like I feel like each week I learn something or I change a little bit, and so I think I have like a skeleton of a first draft, but that doesn't really mean much because I think I'll go back and change a lot of it, and I'm just trying to go slow. I thought I was going to be done this summer, which was insane. Not even close. And I think it'll probably be done next year sometime. But I'm just trying to write, like if I get hit by a Mexican bus tomorrow, I'd be like, well, at least I finished that book. So I'm trying to make something like real good.
Yeah, hopefully you won't get hit by a bus.
Yeah, hopefully.
Allison and I have tried talking about writing a book together. And, one of the things we I will say is I really want to focus on seems like it's already been written, in some ways between the knowledge of like Kate and the knowledge of you and some of the stuff that Josh and Jeannie have written. So it's almost like I want us to like organize it in a way where we can at least bring something new because it seems like there's so much already written, in some ways. So I don't know. We've played around with talking about doing it, so it's going to be an interesting collaboration when we finally choose how we're going to write it or what it. But we know that this process is not easy, and it is quite a challenge. So.
Yeah, that's like for me, it's like an understatement. It's like been the hardest thing I feel like I've ever done.
Oh wow! Yeah.
But I guess I think that like it's like self pressure because I identify with what you just said. Like, why do it if it's already been done already? Like if Ray has already put out all the details, why would I like waste the time to regurgitate what he said? And so if you like. I felt at one point, I was like, okay, I think I can like uniquely voice this and do something different. And if I ever feel like I'm not doing that, or if I'm like just regurgitating what Ray is saying, I'll usually like erase it and try to start over. So yeah, it's difficult. It's not like a healthy thing to write a book, I feel like.
Yeah, you're doing a lot of sitting too, right? Or standing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I do want to definitely plug your Patreon page, Danny, and just let everybody know that they can find your Patreon page at patreon.com/DannyRoddy, and we'll put a link on the YouTube video as well for this. But do you want to say anything about that? Because I've been involved in 2 of your live streams, which I really liked a lot. So
that's good to hear. Yeah, that's the only way I make money. So not that somebody should or shouldn't pay me, but like I don't have any extra incentive to sell supplements or my books are free. And so when Patreon came out, I was like, oh, what a unique opportunity to liberate myself from any kind of commercial endeavor of selling things. Mm-hmm. And I don't anything I'd ever make, I was like so excited to release it out and like to share with people that it always was like, oh, I have to put a price tag on this so I can pay rent and it would always felt weird. And so I'm so fortunate to my patrons that like support you, Allison, like the people that support me, and I can kind of have go in different directions. Like I'm doing a CIA podcast with Ray next week or this week on Thursday. Yeah. And so I just don't feel like that would ever happen. Like, I don't think that's going to be a big money maker. Like it's just something that's going to happen that I'm interested in doing with him. Yeah. And, so yeah, just like let me be a artist and like do whatever I feel like doing, which is just incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's kind of how I feel about it too. We started a Patreon page. We have we haven't really launched it yet, but it's we're getting ready to officially launch it at some point. But people can find that at patreon.com/integrate yourself, and it's the same idea. We want to really just connect with our community and do similar things to what you're doing as far as like, answering people's questions and being available for that and also putting our work out on that as well. So I thought it was really cool. You kind of gave me some ideas on how to do it. So it's still kind of uncharted territory for me though. Yeah. Well,
I think it's uncharted territory in general. I think me and Rhonda Patrick, and I think she uses
she's doing really well on that, actually.
Yeah, really well. I think she uses it a little differently than I do, but like I was so happy to make it work because I just hated selling things. So I think that's
it keeps
amazing
you from using advertisers too and selling people like supplements, and that's why
Exactly.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Danny. Any closing statements that you'd like to make, or any way to the best way to contact you would be?
You just email me at dannyroddy@gmail.com is fine, or tweet me. I've been tweeting a lot lately, so that's like a good way of figuring out what I'm up to.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on. We really enjoyed this
conversation.
Thank you so much. We'll have to have you on again because I'm sure that I had so much more I wanted to talk about with you, but I think, we have to cut it off at some point. So we'll have to have you back at another point because, there's always
It'd be
more
my
to
pleasure.
talk about.
Totally.
Yeah. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you. And
Thanks,
we'll
Allison.
talk to you
Thanks,
soon. I'll email you.